I wouldn't say that there's this decision or that decision. I would say everything is still owned by people, by HR, but there's endless amounts of help that can come into it. And we're just at this starting point.
What we're starting to see is increasingly people are modifying the way in which they're working to be seen to be digitally present and to be seen to be digitally active. And then potentially they've admitted to us even in interviews, right? I'm doing worse work, but I'm doing it in order to stay, in order to appear as though I'm doing work.
If a good HR executive is really engaged, then they're using that insight to further their personal experiences with the employees. And I think that's where it's exciting. It doesn't mean that HR has to become, mathematicians and, just looking at the data. No, I don't think that at all. But I do think there's value that's going to add to what they can do and help their interpersonal and their communications with their employees.
My guest today is Keith Goode, who's the Vice President of Services at ZeroedIn Technologies. Welcome to Humanity Working, Keith.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Now, ZeroedIn is an HR platform that provides organizations with data insights into their workforce. And they use techniques like data mining, collective listening, machine learning, and predictive modeling to gain an understanding of what is happening inside organizations. But don't worry if you don't know what any of those are. Today, we're not going to be focusing on the technology side of this. We're going to be more focused on what we're seeing in the data and how technology can help us going forward. So, Keith, let's start with something pretty simple. So your world, the broad definition or the broad area in which you work is people analytics. So for people that are not in this field, I'd love for you to explain what people analytics is and why it can be useful.
Yeah, so I'd love to. And to get into that, let me tell you a little bit about my history. So I've got 20 years of experience in analytics and reporting, mostly specializing in the HR space. And my passion really lies in generating value from data. So what is HR analytics? Well, if you think about it, HR organizations have a tremendous amount of historical data that is so siloed. It's, payroll systems, it's learning management systems, it's performance systems. And how many times have we seen an organization that they often hop from one platform to the next? So not only you have this historical data, but it's also formatted quite different from those various systems that organizations have utilized over the past several years. But HR analytics, and especially what we try to do, is mine that data, bring it together, correlate it together, and then look at some of the advancements in predictive modeling and help organizations take that data and glean value from it by predicting what might happen in the future regarding their workforce. It could be anything. It could be something like who might be at risk of leaving the organization, especially if you have skilled resources or people that you've spent a lot and invested a lot. You don't want them leaving the organization. It would cost you a lot, and let's face it, they might go to a competitor, so there's that opportunity cost as well. So if we can utilize that historical data, we can utilize some of the relationships in that the organization already has, and learn from that data and to who might be at risk, there's a lot that could be done to try to stave off that loss. That's just one example. Other examples might be, finding a person that's ready for promotion, or looking at your candidates that you're looking to hire and trying to utilize some historical data to find out who might be those stars waiting to come onto your organization. So a variety of different things that could be used. But overall, it's really giving the executive team, HR team, a method to kind of peer into the possible future and react to it.
Yeah, so Keith, you touch on a couple of really interesting things that I just want to zone in on just for a second. So the first thing is about this concept of siloed data. So
Yeah.
for people that are in technology fields, they'll be very, very familiar with this concept, and it really comes through I suppose, really sets of historical decisions that happen inside companies. So you're in a company, some vendor comes and says, hey, we've got this great software product that will solve problem X or Y or Z. And so you say, oh, I need that product. It will solve this problem that I have. And of course, that product has a whole bunch of data that is associated with it. And then a year later, some other vendor comes in and is solving a new set of problems, and you're going and you're grabbing that information. And at no point, in most cases, are we thinking about, oh, what value could we get by combining those two pieces of data, and what more could we learn, and what more could we understand? And one of my observations is that certainly in the HR field, that whole concept even of like thinking about the underlying value associated with all of these different pieces of data is something that's relatively new for a lot of HR professionals, and they've never really thought about that. So as you're going into organizations, how do you make the light bulb go off and go, okay, here are the 4 or 5 pieces of data. Here is the magical insight that you can generate if you can just see across those different data sets. How do you get people to that point where the light bulb lights up and they go, oh, that's of high value?
Well, it's interesting concept. Sometimes it's harder than others to try to do it. But I would say that most executives and most senior leaders understand the value of making better decisions, and
Mm-hmm.
so that part's kind of easy. I think the challenging part is helping them understand, the data. They look at that historical 10 years of people data and like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where it exists, the format of it, all
Yeah.
these different platforms. But in reality, the other concept I like to bring out is history has its way of repeating itself. So,
Mm-hmm.
understanding that, people can then say, yeah, you know what, there could be some real value to all of that. And so those are two mechanisms. I think, people generally do understand the value of some of these interesting predictive models that are out there, and what they can bring to light and value they offer. So we try to hone on that, but then try to say, that heavy lifting of cleaning that data and bringing it together, let vendors, let others that have that expertise, that history in doing that, let them help you out with that, because it is a challenge and it can be, overwhelming to a lot of organizations.
Is that it's fairly obvious to see that in a large company, that everything you're talking about could be of high value. So a company with like multiple thousands of people and things like that. But of course, almost every large company starts as a small company. And at the point at which it's a small company, the HR leadership is going to be like, and the managers, frankly, in that organization and the leaders inside that organization are going to say, I know my people. I don't need
That's
this. I
right.
know my people, right?
Yeah.
So at what point, and I'm not expecting you to say, 478 people or something like that, but at what point does a company get to a point where it's needing the types of services that you guys are offering, and what should leaders be doing if they're in a company that is growing right now to prepare themselves for that eventuality?
I think in general, organizations that have 1,000 or more employees could definitely benefit because they have that historical data. They've had that growth. They have, there's not one person that knows all 1,000 people in the organization. So I think that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of a fair starting point. However, for the smaller organizations, I think there's still a lot of opportunities that can be had. And I think an example might prove that to be evident in terms of
Yeah.
we've worked with an organization, it's a fairly small organization, and they had people that were certified in certain tasks, and their work came in from all different areas, and the certifications that the people held were sometimes geographically, sometimes nationally. Mostly it was in the accounting and auditing aspect, right? So you have these highly skilled people that had different certifications, and the work that came in, some was hard, some was less hard. Some had to go and follow people that had certain certifications to be able to work on. So there are aspects of generating models that could be used to help score the work coming in, and
Mm-hmm.
then identify and work to score or identify the resources, what their current bandwidth is, and then there's a theory called the backpack theory, which is how much stuff can you put in a backpack, right? And there's an optimal way of doing it. Well, we took the same kind of algorithms and said, okay, well, let's score the work coming in and let's figure out how to optimize the delivery of the different tasks across this skilled workforce. And you don't need a large organization to do that.
So you joined ZeroedIn a little over 10 years ago,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So this is a field that that I know has changed a lot over the course of the last 10 years. So I'd love you to do a little bit of a compare and contrast. What's different today than it was a decade ago in this field?
I think, well, that, and you would know this very well. That's really different and exciting today are the models that are
Mm-hmm.
available to us. There, you've got the large language models, you've got the predictive models, the artificial intelligence that are coming to light, and in a lot of cases it's open source, so we can start taking advantage of some of these really neat things. However, there are some things that still are kind of baselines in that maturity model before we can start taking advantage of some of these really neat things that are out there. There's still things that need to happen, that basic block and tackling that needs to be there. One, it's unfortunately some data cleaning. It's aggregating that data together. Two, it's having that platform that people can go to for a single source of truth, whether it's simple things like head counts or tenure or turnover. That still needs to exist. And I would say that to take advantage of some of the newer capability and some of these new modeling, you want to have those basics, that foundation in place, right? You don't, when you build a house, the key element is the foundation, and then you build the stories on top of that. And you think of machine learning and AI is just another story in your building, and you have to have a solid foundation to continue that building up. And that foundation comes when good clean data, mechanisms to report out, whether it's your current reporting and the reporting that's been around, that block and tackling reporting, and then it's growing on top of that platform to be able to identify some modeling, some predictive models, as well as I think where things are going to get exciting in the future is uh, AI has the ability to do really two things. One, summarize,
Mm-hmm.
take a whole bunch of data and then, hey, summarize, my last 4 quarters of turnover compared to new hires and our employee headcount. Well, it can look through that tremendous amount of data and then respond back to it with a pretty decent summary, written and explained fairly well. That's one aspect. And then the other aspect is drilling in deeper and having that AI say, okay, well, I want to learn what's going on in this organization for this job type. And they can AI can take that data and drill in and then provide another explanation for what someone might be saying. So it's that summary and explanation that becomes, I think, the future of what we're seeing.
So Keith, I want to challenge you a bit on this
Yeah.
whole aspect of data driven decisions around people. And I'll bring a couple of examples that we've seen in our field when we've done interviews with people about how data is used inside organization. So the first, I think I would refer to it almost as almost like the Big Brother effect, as in Orwell's Big Brother, not the TV show.
Yes.
and and what we've encountered is levels of concern about how data-driven decision making is potentially replacing, human judgment inside organizations. So a good example that we've seen fairly regularly is people that spend periods of time during the workday on the grid and spend periods of time during the workday, in quotes, off the grid. Doesn't mean they're not working. Doesn't mean they're not creating value. But for example, let's say it's the human that knows they need to spend 2 or 3 hours in a day or something along the lines of shutting everything down, sitting in front of a whiteboard or sitting on in front of a traditional offline mechanism to think, right? in order to move themselves materially forward. What we're starting to see is increasingly people are modifying the way in which they're working to be seen to be digitally present and to be seen to be digitally active. And it's then potentially they've admitted to us even in interviews, right? I'm doing worse work, but I'm doing it in order to stay, in order to appear as though I'm doing work. And the ultimate example of that is the mouse jigglers and all that kind of stuff, right? That people spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make it look like they're busy, right? So that's the first piece of it. And then related to that, what we see is concern more broadly from employees and from managers and so on as to what do I need to do as an employee to look good in the numbers versus just focusing on getting work done and trusting, as it were, that the analytics will show that I'm doing good work. So I'll pull those two things together and say it's what we see from employers, from employees, and from managers in particular is a concern that we're using this data in sort of a fairly one-dimensional way. We're missing strong talent, and we're changing behaviors of people that have a concern about this creepy underworld of data analyzing what they're doing. I don't know exactly how to turn that into a question, but I'm
Yeah,
just curious as to what your thoughts are about all of that.
yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, so I wish we could talk about it for the rest of the week. But absolutely, I think there's two things to unpack there. I think, first is with those individuals out there that are kind of just filling a seat, working and doing
Mm-hmm.
kind of what they do. I would say that from a HR analytics perspective, there's also a lot of effort out there to reduce bias in any of its predictive modeling. And in fact, you've got states like New York State that have actually written legal laws now that it says that if you're doing a predictive modeling in the HR perspective, it has to be audited for bias.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is, I would argue you don't need a law to do that. I would say that most people that are, anyone that's worth their salt in analytics would be doing that anyway. But it's kind of interesting that there's that effort in there and driving that. So bias is important, and I think that we've always had that type of work uh, going on where people that could they be more productive, and I think actually
Mm-hmm.
analytics can help determine that and help can find where there might be ways to help people be more engaged and where you can focus your resources to help that productivity. So that was one aspect. The second aspect is more futuristic, I would say, and I think where we need to go with our workforce is creativity. Creativity, you call it think or thought. I like
Mm-hmm.
that approach where people can go and think, but what's going to set us apart from other workforces and from the machine learning as well and the AI is our ability to be creative, our ability to either use numbers or use facts in the past or and do something creative. And I think it's the people that can tap into their creativeness with some of that historical data and with some of an understanding of value. Those are the ones that are going to be successful. So that gets back to the humanity of work. It's showing our creativity side in order to produce value.
Yeah. A couple of things I think I would add to that is that there is there's data that can show a good element of what of how humans are proceeding and progressing in the workplace. The data is incomplete, right? It always will be. So, for example, if I am inside an organization and I'm doing a learning and development program within the organization that is part of an approved learning and it's part of an LMS that the organization has, that will get picked up. But if I am attending a physically attending a community college after hours
Yeah.
and it's not recorded anywhere in my work environment, that will not get picked up, right? So there will be a picture. A picture is generated, and that picture is partially is a partial picture of the human being inside the organization. I think it's incumbent upon organizations, if they're going to build high trust organizations, to share with employees how, as best they can and in very meaningful ways, how data is being gathered, how data is being analyzed, and what, if you like, the rules of the game are, right? And because if you don't share that, then employees are going to guess and they're going to start doing things based on the degree of trust they have. And the degree of trust they have in you as an organization won't necessarily be very high if you're not sharing stuff.
Yeah.
So it's always wise to be transparent in the organization as to what you're doing with data, why you're doing it, what the purpose of it is, why you believe it to be helpful to the organization and to the people inside the organization. And then also to recognize when you're measuring people that picture that you do have is incomplete, and there are other elements that can be brought into the picture, and give employees a chance to share that, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, if an employee is doing something at a community college after hours that wouldn't be picked up on a system inside the organization, have them be able to share that information and have that to be considered as part of the overall evaluation as to who they are. I think we have a tendency, I think, inside organizations to hold all this information really close to our chest versus actually share how it's used and use it as an opportunity to increase trust inside organizations. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll even challenge you now on that and say, especially in some of the younger workforce, I would say that should be an assumption. That should be an assumption, and I would argue that many of them already know that. So, you've got people in high school today that realize whatever they post online is going to be available when they go for their first job interview. So, I think the assumption should be that as an organization, you're looking at maximizing your assets, and data is a valuable asset, and it could be private data or public data. I would argue that organizations are somewhat negligent if they don't tap into that. And yes, I think it's always good that they communicate that, absolutely. But I think people should always have that assumption that, hey, I work for an organization and they're doing everything possible to gain as much value for the organization, for their clients, and for their employee resources.
Yeah, I think we'd actually agree on that. I think the main issue here, though, is that as an employer, it's beneficial for you if that picture is as complete as possible, and as an employee, that actually is generally true too, right? So, find the more transparency there is as to how this is gathered and how this is measured and how it's used and so on, the easier it is for those things to happen.
Yeah,
right. And
definitely.
So, for example, the employees that are worried, for example, about this concept of going offline during a day, and will that impact how they're perceived inside an organization and so on, they should know, does that or does that not, right? In some cases it will, in some cases it won't. So I think there's a lot of work to be done inside organizations to get the technology side of this is going to be solved faster than, if you like, the human, the human aspect of this, and how we respond, and how we delve into all of the different aspects of it. It's really fascinating field.
It really is.
Yeah. So, as you say, it's changed a lot. I'm curious as to what you think this all means in terms of how HR itself is practiced, right? Historically, HR has been, as you pointed out, like lots of data silos. And because of lots of data silos, incomplete pictures of what's happening to employees inside organizations. You're helping some of that go away. What do you think is the ultimate way in which the practice of HR will shift as we develop bigger pictures of the humans inside our organizations?
I think that's a great question, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and that's what excites me about working in the field that I'm in. If you look at the historical aspect of HR, it's always been very people oriented, which is fantastic. Um, and I think now with some of the introductions of reporting and modeling, it takes that to another level. It takes
Hmm.
if a good HR executive is really engaged, then they're using that insight to further their personal experiences with the employees. And I think that's where it's exciting. It doesn't mean that HR has to become, mathematicians and, just looking at the data. No, I don't think that at all. But I do think there's value that's going to add to what they can do and help their interpersonal and their communications with their employees. So I think that's where the excitement is. Also, I get back to that creative aspect is,
Hmm.
I think HR has been very standardized in the past. It's been, this is what HR does. It's the same things over. It's the pay, it's the benefits, it's the training. It's right now. This is turning upside down. It's figuring out where those things can really be utilized to be much more efficient as opposed to just a standard thing. And so I'm excited about it. I'm excited about where HR is going, and not so much to be at a seat at the table. I think that statement's long gone. I think what will help them is identifying these areas where they can be add more value. The value gets them to the table, not just these practices. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think what's interesting here is I think you're actually highlighting both an opportunity and a danger. Actually, so on the opportunity side, I think you're exactly right. Right, we're using this data as a tool in order to be able to be more effective and creative and create a larger, a better picture of the humans that are working inside our organization. That can only be of help. I think the danger is that for many people that have worked in this field of HR, after uh, drinks after work, the sort of stuff that they're often talking about is how there is a there's a gap inside organizations between what many HR leaders want to be and want to represent inside their organizations and what they actually do. So, particularly inside larger organizations, it is, and I know this because I've worked in a couple of
Yeah.
them, it is not uncommon for the employee's attitude towards HR to be, they're the people I see on day one, and I don't want to see them ever again until the day I leave, because I know the moment that they're in a room with me, it means that I'm being escorted out the door, right? And
Right.
so it's
Right.
and so there has been historically a lot of distrust between employees and HR based on the idea that HR is working for the man and they're not working for me, right?
Right.
And so I think that this is why that this use of data is such a fascinating thing, because used right, it can help mitigate some of those challenges. Used wrong, it can only perpetuate the idea that HR is big brother HR, and HR is making like number based decisions about me with no, and they don't know who I am. They don't know anything. They don't know, in quotes, know anything about me. All they see is a bunch of data points. And so I do think this really points to the idea that HR, you don't get to be strategic HR just by saying it,
Right.
right?
Right.
To your point, right? You get to be strategic HR by being it. And
That's right.
so, therefore, this is a real opportunity for HR to be much more strategic and actually start living the people side of chief people officer better. So I love the way you framed it, because I think it really points to the idea that there's a bit of an inflection point here.
Yeah, it is, and it reminds me of a story. Was working with a company or an organization, a municipality, and we helped them analyze some data, and it was quite interesting. We were focusing on the gap of positions within the year that someone may have left and before someone hired, and taking a look at that budget amount that otherwise would have gone unrecognized, and then
Mm-hmm.
utilize that amount to do end of year bonuses at much higher rates.
Mm.
So, there is a positive side for the employee to understand, hey, HR is doing this great stuff with this data, and it's helping my bottom line. So, yeah, there's two edges to that sword.
Okay. Um, Last question for you. So we've talked a lot about data. We've talked a lot about the value that it can bring, and obviously we've discussed the flip of that, particularly in terms of how employees might regard the use of this and the fears they might have associated with data being used extensively in their organization. Just broadly thinking, as somebody who's in this field, where do you think is the right balance between gathering all those data and acting upon this data, and then using more traditional, the traditional, if you like, art of this process, which is, how does a manager feel about their employee, and how do employees' colleagues, feel about working with them, and sort of gathering all of that intel together. I'm thinking of this almost along the lines of sports as an analogy, right? And these days, anytime you bring up like Moneyball or the Oakland A's, somebody at some point in a discussion will point out, well, you do realize that the Oakland A's haven't won the World Series since all of that revolution started, right? So with the point being that there is a balance here between doing what the data tells you and using judgment and art and experience and all of that kind of stuff. So how do you think that applies in this field? What is the balance between cold hard data and the art of performance management?
I think it's an easy response. I think the decisions are always the responsibility of an individual. However, it's every decision now has the opportunity of receiving help from analytics. So, I wouldn't say that there's this decision or that decision. I would say everything is still owned by people, by HR, but there's endless amounts of help that can come into it. And
Mm-hmm.
we're just at this starting point. Yeah, we've got new models for flight risk and rising stars and things, but we're still early in this. And I would never give up control of the final decision, though the models are going to get better and stronger. But still, the ownership of the decision is still relies in people.
Keith, great place which to leave it. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. And if any would love to carry on the conversation, as you can tell, I'm always up for it. So I can be reached on LinkedIn. My handle's Keith A. Goode. So, or you can contact ZeroedIn.com. Always happy to continue the conversation.
Sounds great, and we'll put all the details of that on the show notes as well.
Thank you very much.